So now the reason for this setup is because I'd like to demonstrate baking the light, and we can do that from the window menu in light mapping. But first, let's add a floor so that we could see the shadows which the cubes would cast once the light is baked. So I'm gonna go ahead and add a plane, reset that position, drag it down a bit, just make sure it's slightly below. And I don't need high precision, so I don't need to use isometric. That looks pretty good. Next, let's load up the light mapping tool from window light mapping. Now, one of the requirements is that all the objects that we want to bake are set to static. And the reason for that is if your object was not static, it would mean it can move during runtime. And so the shadow and the light map that has been baked would stay in position, yet your object would move, so it wouldn't look right. So let's just go ahead and set the cubes to static as well. And at this point, we could just hit bake scene. And yes, we have to save the scene before we bake, so I'm going to call mine main. And then the baking process begins as indicated by this progress bar. And there we go. How I can demonstrate that baking has worked is I can disable the lights. And as you can see, the scene is still lit. And also in the main folder, you can see that it created a texture with the baked light maps. So that looks pretty good so far, but we didn't get any shadows, and that's why we set up the plane on the bottom. So to do that, let's go back to our directional light, enable it, and then under shadows, set that to soft shadows. And let's bake the scene again. There we go. And we can see the shadows. So let's do the same for the point light. And that looks pretty nice. So the point light seems to be washing out some of the shadow here, so I'm going to turn it down just a little bit, maybe a 0.6, and I'll also change the color slightly so we can see the contrast between the directional light and the point light. Okay, so it's a bit softer now, and I'll do the same to the directional light except use a cooler color. Alright, the next thing I'd like to cover is ambient occlusion. So if we bump that up to 1, bump this up to about 1 as well, this adds a shade or darkness to objects that are in proximity of each other. So if I were to move this where it's actually intersecting the ground and bake again, now that it's done baking, you can see it adds a soft shade along the sides of the cube, as well as the original, which adds the soft shade underneath it. And so the max distance specifies how far or close the objects have to be from each other to get the ambient occlusion effect. If I set it to 0, it's actually infinite. So it does reach out further and have more of an effect, and I can also increase the contrast. Overall, baking your lights or light mapping has two effects. It makes your scene look more realistic when it comes to lighting or shadows, but it also can increase performance because shadows and lighting are both not done runtime any longer.